How long was the Ice Age, just for the audience?
Well, the Ice Age was well over 20,000 years. Now, not contrary to what some might believe, there wasn't ice just covering the entire northern hemisphere. In fact, one of the anomalies that I want to point out that's very interesting is that the ice was centralized around areas that you would never imagine. Like, for instance, northern Siberia was ice-free, right? One of the coldest places on Earth that we have today was completely ice-free. The ice was focused around, if you were to say a focal point, would have been Greenland. And now, that has led to a lot of theories and hypotheses regarding that the North Pole, the pole was actually over Greenland and not where it is in the Arctic now, which would mean that we had a different type of hemispheric effect where the ice sheets and where different things were, and that may have been part of what shifted the axis of the Earth. Do not underestimate the weight of miles of ice. I mean, the Laurentide ice sheet in North America is estimated to have been somewhere between 2 and 3 miles deep, covering all of Canada down into parts of the northern United States, and of course continuing up into Greenland, and then you had the Eurasian ice sheet. But these ice masses are some of the largest that Earth has ever had. And when you have that much weight, you can actually cause enough to not only suppress surfaces down into the ground, but you can cause so much weight that it's like it almost causes like a spinning sphere to cause to almost wobble on itself because it has too much weight on the top side.
Interesting. And so you had this Ice Age for 20,000 years. What exactly happens in the older Dryas, and then what happens in the younger Dryas in your assessment?
Well, I'm someone that spent the last 10 years extensively studying climatic events, geologic climatic events, but specifically through two things. The Antarctic ice cores, which, by the way, you can go back to 450,000 years on those ice cores, which is insane to see that. That's the oldest ice cap on Earth, bar none. And that's why I don't believe the civilizations were into Antarctica. Because we have ice cores showing how old that ice cap is. Okay, and that is why I think mountains look like pyramids there, is because there's been little to no erosion by wind or rain or anything. They're almost like these giant mountains made out of certain stones that have been almost stuck in an ice cap and haven't been able to weather. Now,
the Antarctica conspiracy theorists are going to be very disappointed.
I know, they'll be sad about that one.
Yeah.
Now, but you know what we need now? We need real science being brought into this, and that's what I would like to bring to this conversation. Now, the Greenland ice cap is only 20,000 years old, hence the last ice age around 20,000 years. During that formed 20,000 years ago, which means that we only have ice records from Greenland cores for 20,000 years. But we get a snapshot of it to look back and see what it was like. Now, what we find is that 14,500 years ago, carbon spiked astronomically on the planet. And this is again getting into when we look at modern times of people talking about how humans are the only reason why the climate and carbon is increasing. Well, that's absolutely not the case. If anything, we had carbon spikes 14,500 years ago that completely dwarf the time we're in right now. And how that could happen is, I think, based on increased massive amounts of sunlight hitting the Earth, melting things like, increasing, letting like methane off in the atmosphere, increasing plant growth and other things would create a lot of different, carbon, creating this carbon dioxide increase. And also what we found is that in the Antarctic ice cores, every single time that these massive spikes of carbon occur, we get temperatures that then follow right after. Right after. Now, 14,500 years ago, we had a spike in which temperatures went from some of the coldest we've ever seen, and you can see it right in front of you on that sheet, some of the coldest we've ever seen, to levels that were even warmer than we are now.
Whoa.
But in only like a couple hundred years.
So how does that happen? A coronal mass ejection? Is the magnetosphere of the Earth, which protects us from the sun, is that weakening? Is there a pole shift that causes the magnetosphere of the Earth to weaken? There are all sorts of theories. What do you think?
I believe that a massive CME event unlike anything that we've ever seen in modern human history, hit the Earth.
Why do you think that?
Well, because if you look at the spike, it's immediately, at 14,500 years ago during the Older Dryas, it's immediately followed by a drop so drastic that it ends up being colder than even the Ice Age. So you're talking about temperatures that go from an Ice Age that rise warmer than even now, but only remain for, let's say, 100 years or less, and then drop colder instantly.
So
colder than even the Ice Age was.
Why would that point to a coronal mass ejection?
Because if you have a huge amount of heat that hits the Earth, and again, that could also potentially argue an impact, but let's say one of the two, okay? You would, what could only thing that could cause that to happen is if you have an enormous amount of fresh water from glaciers, right? Hence the Ice Age, that melts instantly into the oceans, disrupting ocean currents across the world and basically collapsing things like the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream, for those who don't know, is this unbelievably warm current of water that comes off of the Caribbean and off of Florida, and it dives northeast and then basically rides over the Atlantic. And it's the only reason why people can live in Iceland and in Scandinavia. That area would be a complete barren ice wasteland if it wasn't for that. It's a warm propeller of energy, right, that rides up, and we have ocean currents all over the world. And ocean currents play a very pivotal role in moving heat around the planet and also stabilizing things like the climate. In fact, I think one of the things that's most not understood about our climate is the role that currents play with the oceans in our weather, in our climate of the Earth. And that's why if, for instance, we had enough fresh water melt into and shut off the Gulf Stream, it would be enough to destabilize basically the entire planet. It's a very fine-tuned system of heat being driven down and moving up through, and like it's a whole system.
But if an asteroid, if we hit a comet from the Taurid meteor stream, and that would also cause some, quick heat up versus the coronal mass ejection, why are you weighting it, in favor of coronal mass ejection?
Well, I've never been able to find any evidence of any impact craters anywhere in the Earth that are from that age. Now, Graham had brought up the one in Greenland, but we know that one is over 1 million years old underneath the ice cap, right? Because the Greenland ice cap is 20,000 years old, so that would take that one off the table. Now, that doesn't mean that a Taurid meteor shower couldn't have explosions midair, right? Like we see in Tunguska in the early 1900s. That's possible too, but the reason I lean towards CME events, coronal mass ejection events, is based around these areas of vitrification and what I believe is evidence of plasma discharges all around the world. And that's how you would essentially get poles moving from from the Arctic over to Greenland. Is you would have these events where the entire magnetosphere of the Earth basically gets severely weakened. And then holes open up, and then you get these vitrification types of events and others. And that, to me, the evidence is much more leaning towards a CME event than an impact, which would be more localized to certain areas of the Earth, not on this global scale.
Makes sense. Where do you see the plasma all over the world?
We see plasma events, again, some of the best evidence is out of Bolivia, out of Turkey, around Kavkalesi and others, and we see it in Egypt as well. There are these giant statues. They're actually the largest stone statues in the world, called the Colossi of Memnon, and they have burn marks only on the northeast side, which it lends us to the possibilities that these massive heat areas that opened up with the ozone may have come from the northeast.
But we still can't date the plasma. Right.
No, of course we can't. We can't date that, but we can potentially start to date other things, like, for instance, maybe we can date soil cores from Lake Vaughan, or maybe we can date cores of some of these stones. Because if you can bore in, you can't date a stone from the outside, but if you can bore into it, you can potentially find things like organic matter deep within very microscopic cracks, and you have more of an ability to date them. That's how Göbekli Tepe was dated. The only reason they were able to date Göbekli Tepe is because the site was believed to be buried. You can only date organic matter if it's covered up and concealed. Because if it's out and it's being exposed to the elements, it alters its entire chemistry, and you can't date it the same way.
Yeah.
And what we're looking at right now is the potential that places like Kefkalesi and even Ionis, and we can get into that as we go along, may have been deliberately buried at a later time.
Interesting. So are you hopeful that we can date parts of these monuments that have been covered up, because you can, it seems like, date organic matter that's been buried?
Yeah, I think that we're going to be having increasing capabilities revolving around being able to date these, and then using
what are
all
the capabilities? How do you do that?
Well, we have new technologies coming out that enable us to be able to look at these things in a different way. There's always new things happening with understanding the breakdown of carbon, organic matter based on radioactivity and other things to find dating. But I also think that maybe some of the techniques that we're just coming into is understanding where certain sediments in different cores can help us with dating. And I think that those technologies and things, and I'm not an expert in that, I don't want to pretend to be able to understand that those things can potentially be dated, but only if they come from specific environments in which something unique occurred, in which they were protected.
Does Robert Schoch agree with your coronal mass ejection theory?
That's Robert Schoch, actually, that he's the one who really was one of the top pioneers. His book, Forgotten Civilizations, is the basis behind almost the entire book, was that, and I can go into it briefly, is that when they were in Easter Island, his wife Katie, they were looking at this, what was thought to be a writing called Rongo Rongo. Okay, it's a type of writing out of Easter Island. And when they were comparing it to things even like the Nazca lines in Peru and other areas like maybe Mohenjo-Daro and other types of mysterious writings that don't look like writings, one of the theories that they came up with is that they're not actually writings at all. They're plasma discharge designs in the sky, because we know that electricity follows very specific patterns.
Whoa, wait, you're saying that the Nazca lines were like burned into the surface of the earth?
No, they were imitating potential plasma discharge events in the sky.
Really?
Because maybe they believed that those areas were touched by those events, and maybe they thought they were sacred, or they were showing them. These things, plasma discharges in the atmosphere. Let me give some background on this for a second.
Well, we should, and also just for the audience's sake, Nazca, I believe, was like 200 BC to 600 AD-ish or something, and it's in Peru, and you have all these amazing, it seems like artwork that only makes sense from an aerial view, and they're, over wide distances, and seems, like it would involve some sort of precocious astronomical or artistic knowledge to make, and it's this big sort of mystery that will play endlessly on Gaia and, History Channel.
Yeah, I used to work at Gaia for 2.5 years.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I worked on shows like Ancient Civilizations. Check out season 4 and 5 if you want to see some of me in that.
I will.
In work in
that explains your kind of like, you have the trippiness, and then you also have the, hardcore, I think what's really important is marrying stuff that comes from instinct to research and empiricism. Right. And that's, I think, good science. And I think it's kind of an alchemical process, because it comes from the inside, but then it's being extremely rigorous about, I had this intuition, but I'm not superimposing that onto reality.
Well, and also the aspect of the metaphysical nature of reality, right? Yes. I think that's a very, it ends up being not really married together with the science aspect. They tend to be very separated, right? The science aspect, we're going to look at only the physical third-dimensional aspects of science and evidence, but really there are a lot of things that are disconnecting, is how metaphysical sides of the universe and our spirit, right?
Yeah.
And those concepts have to connect and play in.
Yeah, and we paint over the past with our modern epistemic brush, and we say, these sites were just, they were built in these sort of materialist reductionist ways, and they were used for sort of prosaic reasons. We have no idea how these people from the past actually thought. And the word Gaia actually, I like it in the context of Gaia theory. James Lovelock late 19th century, that the Earth itself is somewhat alive, or just at least extremely resilient.
That's what the ancients believed. They called it Tiamat or Gaia. Gaia was the Greek term, but they believed that it was a living type of being that's not like us. And they also believed that the sun is just the same thing. They're like entities. And then in ancient cultures had names for them, like Utu was the name for the sun god in ancient Sumer. But let me get back to something that we were talking about that I think is important.
Yes.
The plasma events, okay? If the Earth was going to get hit by one of these massive CME events, which it's interesting how the Aurora Borealis is further south than we've seen it in a very, very long time right now.
People are freaking out.
Right, and that's potentially...
This guy on Twitter, Space Weather News?
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
He's freaking out about, and I never know how seriously to take. I mean, clearly we've seen more solar activity this year than ever, and it seems to be ramping up. And you have all these flares, and he attributes that to a weakening of the magnetosphere of the Earth.
And I agree. And because if you look at the Great Year,
should we be freaked out, Matt? Or
well,
is the world about to end?
if you look at the Great Year, which again is about 25.5 to 26,000 years, right? Half of that is because it's call it 25,000, but it's like 24,600. Half of that is 12,000 with change. These events that occurred during the Younger Dryas, with what I believe was the last CME event, was 12,500 years ago. So we're literally exactly in that time period, and we're seeing these extreme warming and these plasma-like type of weakening of the magnetosphere type of events, just like we saw then.
This is not at all scientific. This is purely my own, it's like asserting free will or something like that. Something I sort of refuse to go outside the bounds of. So I'll admit this is kind of dogmatic, but I just don't believe that every 12,500 years there's just a hard reset button. We've got to have some sort of agency around this.
I can go into that if you want to.
I
actually have some evidence you probably haven't heard of yet that might blow your mind on that.
Please.
Okay, so again, like I mentioned, there's always indications that these things are going to happen way ahead of time, right? CO2 spikes, temperatures spike. You get these geomagnetic events with these Aurora Borealis, right? You see them. Now, the next level, if we start seeing this, we need to worry, is plasma discharge designs in the sky, which is what I was just talking about with what was Dr. Robert Schoch's theory on a Rongo-Rongo text, and even potentially the Nazca lines, is that they're actually these geometric formations that occur in the sky based on massive amounts of what are called charged solar particles that come into our upper atmosphere, and they create these very interesting electromagnetic designs, okay? Now, I want to discuss something that might be new to you, and if you're interested in seeing an image of what I'm talking about, it's on the bottom of my main page of my website, thestageoftime.com. In 1987, there was an encyclopedia that came out called the New Science Encyclopedia, okay? And this is back before computers were really up and running, or we didn't have that capability, so information you really got through encyclopedias, right? That's where things came through. Well, it had this unbelievable image on, I think, page 2,488, if something like that, where it showed, and it didn't say really much about it. All it said is the following image is a diagram based on Pioneer 10 and 11 probes, okay? And then it said we sent out a plaque on it, blah, blah, blah. Well, what it shows, and I can get into what Pioneer 10 and 11 found, because it directly relates to this entire Great Year, this entire cycle, and how might help you understand why this stuff keeps happening at 12,000 to 12,500 years every time.
Interesting.
Okay?
Yeah.
Is that what they found, and this may be new to people and it may blow a lot of minds, and I would again encourage people to go to my website and see that image, by the way, which is very hard to find online. Seemed like it was scrubbed.
Where was it
across
taken
a lot
exactly?
of things. I ended up digging in and finding a PDF version of it that was somebody might have emailed it to me or whatever, where I got a high definition version of it, and then I scanned it, and then I uploaded it, and so I'm like, we need to preserve this, right?
Where was it taken exactly?
Well, okay, I'll go back and tell you how this started.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, there were the first probes ever in history that were sent out in deep space. It's funny to me how people have only heard of Voyager, right? They're like, oh, Voyager. No, Pioneer.
Yeah.
Pioneer came before Voyager, hence the name Pioneer. It was the first deep space probes we ever sent out into interstellar space, okay? If you think about neighborhoods of space, the area between us and the sun is this actually quite small little neighborhood. Our outer solar system is this whole other vast area beyond the sun that then basically is bordered by what's called the Kuiper Belt, right? I'm sure Graham talked about that being impacted by the torrid meteor shower, right?
Yep.
Torrid meteor shower comes through, and one of the theories is it can bump around some of these Kuiper Belt objects, which are giant asteroids and comets in the outer part of our solar system that basically dwarf our asteroid belt around Mars that is like nothing compared to this, okay? Well, Pioneer 10 gets sent out one direction and Pioneer 11 gets sent out another direction. And they were basically sent out to study gravitational protrusions on the outer planets of Uranus and Neptune. They wanted to understand, wait, what the heck? Why are these giant gas planets tilted on their axis? And then as you get closer to the inner solar system, and I'm not an astrophysicist, but I can fill in some blanks here. Why they would be tilted on their axis. Something gravitationally is affecting them, right? Is it our sun? Wait, it can't be our sun. How can they be tilted like that? And in fact, our entire solar system is tilted slightly on an axis. So what happened is they send out the probes in the during the 1970s. Both of them, they send them in completely different directions. Remember, space is 3D, so it's not like a linear paper, right? It's got mass, it's got everything, so you have to go different directions to try to understand how to create like a model, right? Well, in the early 1980s, Pioneer 10 and 11 made history because they were the first probes to leave our inner solar system, okay? So they get out past the gravitational influences of the sun, and they start passing beyond the Kuiper Belt. And when they do that, boy, did they find something. Now, I'm not surprised you haven't heard of it. Actually, very few have.
What did they find?
Well, the thing is funny about it is that if you go and look up Pioneer 10 and 11, you're not going to find very much information. And I don't want to necessarily just spend a lot of time going down a conspiracy road here, but I will tell you that it seems apparent that the internet was scrubbed of information regarding Pioneer 10 and 11.
What evidence do you have?
Well, there was an astronomer out of NASA, named Thomas, two astronomers, one named Thomas Van Flandern, and the other named Robert Harrington. Robert Harrington was a very, very important astronomer who worked for the Navy. Sorry, not NASA, for the Navy. He was a chief astronomer for the Navy.
Okay.
Well, he's studying the outer solar system. He gets a call one day from Thomas Van Flandern. Thomas Van Flandern is an astronomer as well, who's actually a very interesting man. I wish he got more attention. Very smart, used to talk about even things like ancient history being different than we're told and things like that.
Cool.
Very smart guy. He calls up Robert Harrington. He's like, hey, Robert, you got to check out this data from Pioneer 10, right? There's something going on in the outer solar system. And Robert Harrington's like, okay, I'll look into it. And they look into this new data that's coming back from Pioneer 10, and their minds were blown, okay? What Pioneer 10 found, and 11, was not only a planet, okay? Now, I don't want this to be confused with things like Zecharia Sitchin's idea of Nibiru.
Yeah.
That was actually a whole nother story in itself of something I think was maybe even created to mislead this whole thing. Okay, there's no planet that comes through our inner solar system that would destroy everything. No. But what they did find is a large planet beyond the Kuiper Belt. Okay, part of what is called the outer solar system. Not something that has a lot of information. In fact, the Kuiper Belt wasn't found until the early 1990s. It's relatively new that we even knew that, again, based on it's a lot of the data coming back from the Pioneer probes, which started to leave that area in the early 80s and through that period. Now, there in the 90s, there was an announcement by NASA, and I do believe this was a real announcement, where they did announce this planet, and they called it Planet 9 or planet 10 based on before Pluto got demoted. And they actually, and and anybody listening to this might remember that. It was actually pretty widespread on the news. They're like, oh, there's this large planet beyond our sun that is very mysterious. It seems to have a mass based on gravitational influences of 4 to 5 times the size of Earth. Massive. Huge planet, okay? Very weird and mysterious.
Wait, where is it positionally? It's beyond Pluto?
Yes, way beyond Pluto.
Okay.
It's way beyond our inner solar system, and it's not part of the rotation around the sun at all.